Hey everybody, welcome to Mixing with Ro. This is an updated, new look at how I mix Suicide Mission from Mass Effect 2, featuring Lord Bif. For those of you guys who haven't seen, please check out the original video. We put a ton of work into it and we're really happy with it. But of course, not everything is perfect, and that's why we're doing a Mixing with Ro. So I'm going to show you guys what I did, and maybe it'll help out some of you guys who are looking for mix ideas. You know, maybe you'll find something wrong with it, but that'll also be a way for you to learn. So, let's get to it. First of all, I got to collaborate with Lord Bif, something I've wanted to do for a while, and he played the drums through an electronic drum kit, as well as some of the guitars, and helped organize the arrangement a little bit. So we have a drum kit going on. We have a 5-minute song. It's a big, epic ballad. We've got lots of lead guitars going on here. We have rhythm guitars, bass guitars. We have synthesizers. We've got like some synth guitars going on. We have a whole MIDI orchestra, and we have some effects going on here. And we also have a ton of choir vocals from Lord Bif and myself, as well as VST. So there was a lot of working pieces here. So I don't want to take up too much time. Let's go over the logic behind my choices. For the kit, I stacked the kick drum. I like getting both the low boominess, but I also like in metal music to have a very focused kick drum with that clicky sound. So it's kind of like peeking out of there. I like having a lot of snare drums layered because it fills out both that clangy lower end and the snappy high end. So it's really important to me to get both. And that's why I use a couple snares. I actually don't think there's that much logic behind my cymbal choices. They were just what sounded good. I tried out all of them, and same goes for the toms. You know, these pearl ones, the pearl ones sound great. So over here you can see that I've had a lot of EQing just on some of the microphones. These came with either mixed presets, or I was just so concerned about how they sounded going in. I didn't want to mix the individual mics outside of the Superior Drummer 3 window, but I just route them all to the kick, and then the kick here takes them to Reaper. And there's not too much processing there. I don't use the snare bottom mic too much. It's way too rattly. I like keeping the hi-hat in the center for an explosive sort of center feel. My overheads are pulled in a little bit. I actually have to reduce the snare drum a lot because I find it pokes too much if I layer it inside Superior Drummer 3. So the bleed control has been very crucial for me getting the mix I like. As for these ambient mics, these are the room microphones. I really use them to benefit the sort of like that roomy snare sound that you hear in Periphery a lot. And the entire approach for the arrangement and mix was to model Periphery's Lune, which is also kind of like a long, epic rock ballad. So you'll see, quite a lot of the cymbal sounds are kind of reduced just a little bit because there's so much of them, and I want that room sound to really bring out the snare. It might have been a little extreme here, but that's it for the kit and the mix. So, if we take a listen to the drums, we're going to hear a lot of organic sounds from the mix, and I can go over individually how that worked out. So you can get a bit of an idea. So one of the things I liked is with the kick drum, I kind of just sliced out too much of that pokey sound. I really wanted to be able to have someone listen to it and enjoy the beginning, where it's very soft and chill, as well as the parts at the end where it's very, bum, 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 bum. It's kicking really hard, and you get all of that brighter beater sound. So it's really about balance. As far as the compressor, I used the Slate virtual mix rack, and I just dialed down so that there's so you can see there's like hardly any compression going on there. And we can look at a heavier spot. So one of the most important parts of a compressor is the gain reduction measurement, which is how much volume you're losing due to your compressor compressing. So I try my hardest not to overdo it, especially if I'm trying to keep some dynamics. So we're only losing 3 decibels, so I kind of bring up the makeup around 3 or 4 just so that it feels a little more shooty. So it's kind of like kind of still hitting you pretty hard. Now, the snare is still incredibly hard for me to work with. But I also like to do the same. Not too much compression. So the snare you're hearing is mostly just power, and there's even dry mix going on in my compressor. If you have that option, Comp has that. And it just gives you a bit more of the raw ghost note sound. So nothing too fancy. It's going at around 4, a ratio of 4 decibels to 1. Modestly slow attack so that you can get the transient, the punch, the smack of the snare, and then kind of a gentle release. So the snare is, I'm really trying to make the snare sound fat and large and occupy space. To that effect, I'm using an EQ here to boost that low, smacky sort of sound, as well as that high, snappy, bright sound. So the end result is you kind of like hear the low end hit you, and then immediately you get that kind of sustain of the brightness of the room, of the microphone. Now, one thing you'll notice is I didn't want to go overboard with the overheads, overboard with the overheads, because I've been annoyed with Superior Drummer 3. The cymbals are all very raw and very bright, so I did like little divots wherever I felt that the cymbals were kind of crashing. And while I feel like it might have been overboard, it also allowed me to kind of warm things up instead of making them so harsh. So you'll notice that I have Fabfilter Saturn also in the chain. Fabfilter Saturn is a tube saturation and distortion plugin. And what it allows me to do here is kind of give a little more warmth while kind of making sure that nothing felt harsh on the ears. I want people to be able to listen to a 5-minute song and not be drained. So that's what I did there. And while there is a compressor, it's mostly all just to boost the levels. So my idea with the overhead compressor is to kind of control the snare and then just leave everything else alone. I don't like the sound of a compressed overhead bus. I want things to breathe. So likewise with the hi-hats, I just kind of keep it, present. We can hear it here, and it's moderately compressed. If anything, it's actually not compressing very much at all, which is perfectly fine. It's already kind of like a very annoyingly compressed instrument in all these other spaces. For the toms, there's nothing too much to go over. I just cut out a lot of the middleman and kind of control that low end so that you can hear many of the hits. So let's take a listen to the drum solo. Beautiful. So it just keeps everything really in control, which is all I want to do with most of my drums. Now with the room mics, I used to really smash them down. And if you're worried that I'm skipping over anything, it's because I know from my own template creation, it's not important to the mixing process. Or I just disabled it and forgot to take it out. So right now, this room mic is actually being set up so that it just takes off some of the highs because I didn't want to mess with the snares. I think in retrospect, I wouldn't mind breaking this and kind of giving more of the room getting compressed, not just the high end. And one thing you'll notice is the wet knob here is lowered, but so is the dry knob. So basically, I'm blending the super compressed room sound with the natural sound. So you can really, really hear it shine during some of these clean parts, but we're still getting that nice sustain because of using the compressor. So, to put it simply, I want it to sound like you're listening to a real drummer and you're in the room. So that's where the dry comes in. But I also want it to support some of the heavier parts where you can't hear the drums completely, but you want to hear them and you want to glue them together. And that's what the room mics really are for, in my opinion. Next, I have the parallel compressor, and I actually wanted to open up the routing so you can understand kind of my thinking here. So I actually sent the kicks and snares to it, but in different volumes because the snare is also really loud anyway. And the more you compress a snare, it kind of feels really harsh and painful, just like the kick. Same goes for overheads. And, I just balance this out so that it's like the perfect sustaining entity. You'll always hear the drums if you have a parallel compressor, and it kind of glues things together tightly. Now, the last element is a reverb, and the snare drum and the toms get this one. Now, I chose a gold plate because I thought it would be really reflecty and kind of nice, and it does get that 80s sound, but in retrospect, I might just use a regular room. Even though I'm using Fabfilter Pro R, any reverb will do, and I would highly recommend playing with all the ones you have, or even using impulse responses. I kind of like having this as just another room for more color as of late, and I think that if you go overboard with drum reverb, you don't get the punch, you don't get the hit. It feels very distant. So it's an important thing to kind of control. Now, I send all of these to a drum bus, and the drum bus has virtually not much EQ, just a little brightening, and a respectable amount of compression, maybe like 3 or 4 dB. Let's go to a heavier sec. Now, I realize for the past few minutes I haven't been listening to the mix with you guys unless it was soloed out. And that's breaking a little bit of my own rule, of course. I think it's very important that we listen to our mixes not soloed out all the time. I mean, it's good for hearing in specific things if you solo it out, but hearing it in the mix, of course, is how it's going to sound. So, that's basically the gist of the drums as far as the mix goes. And obviously, these are all going to go into my instrumental bus, which is a bus I use now because I find if you put your vocals all in the same routing as your instruments, you might overcompress the vocals and you may not be able to get that nice separation between the two. And that can make it hard to understand the words and so on. So that's the drums. Let's get cracking onto leads. All right, now lead guitar is one of my favorite things I get to do. I think it is absolutely fun, almost like singing. And I think the performance here is really strongly based on that. I'm going to show you what I set up for my tone, because I think tone is part of the mix process, if not one of the most important. So I use a Axe-Fx 2 XL. I highly recommend it, but of course it's very expensive. So an affordable alternative is something like Thermionic or Bias FX. I know there's plugins coming out every day. The Joey Sturgis ones are also pretty great too. And I know that they're coming out with more. It's really just about how you tweak things and how you mix it. So one of the things I like to use is the Freedman Amp Models. They kind of have the warmth of some of the more classic amps, but they also have a really great bite to them. I think that they're great, as well as 5150s. Now, I actually didn't play all of the lead guitars, so now that this thing has finally decided to load, this is my ropey lead tone. It's using a Freedman HB V2 model, which is, of course, based on the real Freedman amps. So I like keeping a medium amount of drive, just enough to where I can feel comfortable playing, and I feel like I have a fairly saturated tone. I actually have to dial back some of these bass and mid controls because I feel you can get a lot of that from the pickups that I happen to use, which for this song were the what are they? Bare knuckle pickup nail bomb set. So it already has a lot of bass and mid, and a lot of your definition comes from the upper mids, which can be controlled by these two knobs. And I also wanted quite a bit of brightness. The depth knob is usually something that works better for rhythms. It kind of brings out that resonating low end, but I didn't feel the need for too much adjustment there. The cabinets I'm using are a Redwire's 4x12 basket weave. It's kind of like a wide sort of sound, which you wouldn't think would make sense for lead guitars, but I feel like this helps back off the leads just a bit and keeps things nice and smooth. I'm also combining that with a 4x10 Super Verb. I think this means that it's an overhead recorded cabinet. I'm not sure entirely what that meant because it just came with one of the packs I use, but this gets a little more warmth. And my idea here is just try them all out and try to balance warmth with, presence. Things that are really sharp and jagged, and then back them off with more mids and smoothness. And control your volume knob too. Then I have a delay going on. It's a digital mono sort of delay with a fourth tempo. And for the song, of course, I did the right tap tempo. I think delay is really useful for getting that sort of epic sound, but it's very important to control. And with reverb, I also used a plate. It kind of kept the notes singing a little bit, but you could really hear the definition. If I play you my guitar solo here, let's take a listen. So basically the leads, going through my patch, maybe the volume knob backed off a little bit. And all I really do from there is I have this EQ, and I like to kind of roll off the low end around, anywhere from 140 to 200 hertz. It depends on the song, but one of the things I have to stress, amp sims are usually really fuzzy, and they're really bright. So I think that it's important to keep some of the low end of your lead guitars so that there's body to it and it doesn't just sound tacked on. Now, a lot of people may have different contexts for that, but in my music, I found that it's important to just kind of reduce the harshness and keep a little bit of that mellow, low sound. It's something that I can listen to for hours. The next thing I do, and this usually is just to control some of these sections, the choruses can get very, very messy very quickly. So I like to slap on a light compressor, slowish attack, slow release, and just kind of ease off some of the crazy leads. Like here, let's listen to the ending of the song where we have harmonizing guitars. So by doing that compressor, we're saving us a lot of trouble. I also have this lead reverb, and it usually goes to like a really large kind of reverb. I'm using a chapel, but I'm cutting off all the low end. If you don't EQ your reverbs, you will end up with a lot of unnecessary resonating frequencies, and you may not enjoy that. So I definitely would recommend, EQ your reverb, use a separate EQ plugin, try to slice things up a little bit. Mixing is a jigsaw puzzle. It's cooking. You can't put too much of one thing. So a lot of this stuff came from there. Now I do want to go over a little bit of how I got this one particular sound. So this is actually a dotted, a delay with a 16th note dotted delay setting. So all I'm actually playing is ba 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 ba, but it's immediately hitting back with an extra slapback note, and it gets this really cool effect that I've enjoyed in a lot of progressive metal music and music in general. So I kind of use that to kind of sustain things while I'm also using a lot of ambient. This is a preset that's just loaded with delays, slowly faded in. But that's how I made most of the leads. And these background leads are just me strumming really hard through a very EQ'd, mids and trebles only sort of patch so that they fill out the chords. Take a listen. So that's lead guitars. Let's talk about the rhythms. They are still fun. Everything I would probably say about the tone is the same as the lead guitars, but with a lot more low end usually. And I actually have to admit, I did not create these presets. I just saved over them. For the rhythm guitars, I used some patches that came with the ML cabinets that Misha Mansour helped design for the Axe effects. So I've been really enjoying this preset in particular. It uses a 6160 model in the Axe effects, and the less drive you have, the more note definition you will get. But the less drive you have, the more you may have to pick to get that same level of saturation or power. So I actually have quite a lot of bass and trebles. This is almost kind of like a Metallica go-to scooped sound. So there is less mids, but my pickups have quite a lot of mid presence. And of course, I usually have to brighten my tones a little bit more to get them to sound recording ready. So let's take a listen to them on their own. One thing you may notice is that they're not super loud or pokey or anything, because I felt that this cover just happened to need less guitar presence in that manner. So let's take a look at how I mixed them. I actually sliced a lot of this out because I wanted to get that very classic produced sound, and I once again had to reference Periphery's Lune, which had very smooth kind of rhythm guitars. You forget that they're there, but it's a guitar song. So I like to sort of sweep off my low end because my tone happens to have quite a lot of low end usually. And I took out spots where there's just too much mud, maybe to an extreme. Usually I kind of get rid of some of the hissiness or where the lead guitars will sit. So that's why I have so many cuts here. And of course around 5,000 and for some reason 7,000, there's also just some sort of harsh hissy noise. This is kind of like a jack-o'-lantern of an EQ. But I wanted to be honest with how I mixed it, so I'm not going to change things. One thing I kind of like to do is just compress the flub only. So I did kind of like an EQ'd compressor, and I only have some of that chug getting lost here. This is where the gain reduction is. It's very subtle, but the purpose, again, is to make sure those few sections that we have just extra low end for whatever reason they're taken care of. The rest of it, of course, is... and I put this on the same bus out of laziness, but maybe this is actually something that works. A center pan stereo guitar that kind of plays clean guitar. Let's take a listen. if you noticed any hiss, that's actually because the OBS screen recording software is probably dying. It's been 25 minutes. But the main idea of that, of course, is it's just a clean guitar based on the Roland Jazz Chorus amp with just enough darkness, kind of, so that it fills out the mix. There's no EQ on this individual track. It's just simple, beautiful, raw, and hopefully it sounds good with, I think, the neck pickup setting, so that I can get a lot of warmth and the chords kind of just blend very nicely. You know, it's not about grabbing attention. The rhythm guitars, especially in this kind of a song, are about supporting the melody and just filling out some of the space. So that's how I did those. I actually have these two unused rhythm guitar tracks because sometimes I like to quad track where I'll record 4 guitars, but I just didn't find it necessary for some reason. Now, I definitely want to talk about this. Now, these are, again, presets that I have downloaded. So, unfortunately, I cannot take full credit, but I do want to share it for sake of transparency. Bass guitar is one of the most critical parts of this entire song. In my opinion, that, it really is the part that I think glued the grooves together. This is an EQ pattern that I've taken from Nolly's Nail the Mix session. Nolly Getgood was the former bassist to Periphery, and he liked to both emphasize the low end and kind of keep track some of the bass's high end. I actually like to strike out some of the high end, and I'm using his signature bass, so hopefully our methodologies are similar. But if you take a listen to the clean bass sound, there's a lot of smoothness. There's some finger sound that you want to kind of reduce. So in order to achieve that, I'm actually using an orange bass model. I find that using a DI is the ultimate way of mixing bass, yes. But when I have an Axe Effects, I kind of get tempted to like throw in one of the millions of amp models. And I found that this one's really just sings. It's kind of smooth. I would highly recommend those of you guys recording with plugins to try doing a bass amp sim as well as a DI and blending both of them. You can see kind of the controls are really weird because they're catered to my bass. And your bass knobs, your bass, your middle, your trebles, or your upper mids, those are the most important controls, as well as your pickup selection. I recorded this using a series mode on my bass, my NG2 bass, so that I could control the neck and the bridge and kind of get this like really thick but smooth sound. It didn't have like any weird characteristics. Now, the performance of the bass, I think, is probably one of the most important parts, and I want to talk about how I achieved this. I used a lot of muting with my fingers, and then I sliced off some of the noise so that I locked in really well with the drums. So if you take a listen, so you can literally see the groove happening with the straight note, bop, bop, boom, next note, bop, bop, boom. And that's the dynamics that you get when you try to play very much with the groove and really try to both control your thumbing, and hopefully I was able to control some of my muting, and if you have to slice off some noise, you have to slice off some noise. But I liked keeping the bass very clean throughout most of the song. I think it speaks to like just having a very full low end, even if it means that you don't get to hear your guitars as much. That much I can put aside the the guitar go there. Now the bass distortion mode is another another preset of mine. And I call this one Row But Nollier because it's basically based off of a preset that I found where someone decided to split the bass sound into 2 tracks. So if you're trying to copy this, I would highly recommend putting 2 tracks together. This one is the DI, and it's just very plain. It's very volume based, a few cuts. And then this one has a filter so that we don't overdrive the low end, because that just makes a mess. Kind of overload the amp. And then we have compressors going in, a pretty tight gate. And then most importantly, we have the Black Glass 7K model, which is actually based on the Dark Glass B7K bass pedal. And this gives me just a bit of dirt onto my signal before I load it into a real guitar amp model. This is the Cameron CCV 2D model on the Axe-Fx. And it's really kind of bright, it's dry, it's spanky, and it even goes into a bass cabinet. And I paired it with another mic. So you get this like really thunderous sound. And then of course, just to make sure that there's no additional low end, I've got another filter on here so that we're really getting a concentrated tone. And it matches with the guitar as well. And that's one of the most important things I think about metal bass, is that if it blends well with your guitars, you'll have a good time. So I would say that the characteristics of this bass tone are having like a really nice, clear DI sound, the direct bass sound, as well as a lower, much quieter, really spanky, dirty, distorted sound that kind of blends with the guitars. And of course, I'm always playing with the groove. I'm always trying to match the kick hits, and I'm always trying to like fill out the space that the guitars may not always achieve. Excuse me. So now I want to kind of go over more briefly just things that I did. With the synthesizers, I like to just have a default compressor. I kind of kept some of the low end here, but I just tried to get rid of. This is where, you know, the guitars sit, the meat sits. This is where the lead guitars sit, and this is where we can kind of sing and really get the brightness out. So you'll notice there's a lot of things like over here. Synthesized guitar using one of the Axe-Fx patches as a, I think a square wave, if I'm not mistaken. And it kind of just adds to that space vibe. Otherwise, I'm using a lot of things from Expand and Massive. They're great, great programs. And they have millions of presets. So whatever you use, you can't really get accused. Oh, that's the same preset he uses. It's kind of fun. So a lot of this is just filling out the chords. So I like to match my big epic choruses with stuff like this. And you'll notice that's like really cheesy strings. They're really cheap. Why would you do that? And it's just because it's cheaper, so it's faster. The attack is fast, the sound is present, and it fills out. Its role is really to fill out, you know, the sound. It's not to sound realistic. To sound realistic, I have the Orchestra Bus. Now, I like having all of the orchestra go into its own reverb, and this one's based off of a concert hall. And the reason why I didn't, you know, I've cranked the wet mix so high is because I wanted to get that, you know, really you're in the orchestra sound, because I didn't think it was important. It's not like I was programming real instruments, you know, for a really important section. But if we take a listen to the Orchestra Bus on its own, so I'm using the East-West Cloud Composer, which has been pretty good. I think it has its uses. So that's what the strings are doing. I also have a separate track for violins. The reason why I did this is because separate samples kind of add to the color, and I can pan them a little wider. I put the French horns where they traditionally would sit in an orchestra, and I put them to the left to play some counter melodies, which was great. And I also used a few concert drums Now, I didn't mix almost any of this because I assumed that out of the box they would sound acceptable for what I was doing. Um, and again, they're kind of like lightly compressed at most. Now, of course, with orchestra, I don't think there's a huge need to compress, so that's, a mistake from retrospect. But I would definitely suggest that if you do, you may want to compress them if you're using it in a metal sort of setting so that you can always hear them. Even if you're just losing 2 or 3 dB, I think it does help. Here's an interesting tidbit. I got cello from Lord Bif, and to kind of help bring out the bright aspects, I just, kind of did a high shell or a high pass and let some of the lower resonating factors come in, and he gave me 2 samples, so they blended beautifully. So again, the idea with that is you have 2 samples, so you can kind of fill in any of the tuning issues. It just sounds fuller. It sounds like 2 cellists are playing. It's a really good idea, and I think it worked out well. So this orchestra bus does serve kind of as a filler. It's not, an orchestra cover, and I think given that, I tried the best I could to give that nice filling, that chocolatey filling. Now here's a part I have never gone over in mixing with row history: how to do choirs. I am not a trained singer. I have asked a lot of friends for suggestions, and what I got was this. I like to model everything with a choir VST. I think a choir VST is a great way to get a practice at how this is going to sound. I also kept it because this let us get women voices, and Lord Bif and I cannot sing that high. Now this is modeled with a contact library for the choir, just something to be there. And what I like to do is I like to sing about 1 or 2 iterations of every single note that gets sung, or every melody. And it doesn't want to open up the MIDI here, but if it did, basically you would see that we kind of broke everything down. So I sang 1 bass. I sang quite a lot of baritone because that's my voice's register. So we kind of broke up the chords and sang the melodies. And then from Lord Bif, I also got sort of the same thing. We have similar singing ranges. So all together, with all of our pitchiness and all of our vocal strength together, it sounds like a much more mighty force. So let's take a listen. So you can kind of tell that it is, again, serving to fill up the sound. It's not the star, but at the same time, we use a lot of effects. I even did some falsetto that I'm not gonna solo, or else no one will love me anymore. But it just becomes this big thing. So what I like to do is I like to use this Chris Lord-Alge plugin just for like that fake produced sound. It kind of brightens things and gives it almost like a chorus effect. I'm pretty sure that's most of what it's doing here. And this is kind of like the equivalent of a guitar amp. It'll get you there as far as like a tone, but you need to work with it or it will not sound great. Then I have a lot of reverb. The reason why I just drowned this sucker in reverb is because I don't think it's the front of the song. So if we didn't have reverb, it might sound a little too dry. So it really, really brings out the best of the vocals by adding that dimension. And last, just because I needed to balance some of the volumes because they got so loud in one bus, is I just did this pretty capped off reverbs or sorry compressor so that we can make sure you're always hearing it. That's really what compression is, the control of volume. And I find that this is a really cool way to do it. It just kind of like, okay, here's your vocals. And I'm not too worried about over compression because that's like the only time I've really compressed all these vocals. Now obviously these are going separately, and I do want to talk about buses and tracks because for some of you guys who don't use Reaper, maybe you've watched this far and you're still not sure. So basically a bus is a track that receives other tracks, and that way you can mix them all together and the effects will apply to all of them. It's kind of like, if you put a bunch of white balls in a box and then you pour red paint inside the box, all the white balls are now red. Everything inside the bus gets affected. So everyone's getting the CLA vocals, everyone's getting the reverb, everyone's getting the compression. That is the best part about buses. And to do it in Reaper, all you have to do is make a new track by double clicking or right click, insert new track, and then make another one and drag it underneath. And if you're still not convinced, you can also do it this way by clicking the route button. And instead of hitting this, you could just hit send and then go to your new track, which is this blank one because I didn't name them. And boom, send to track. And this is now a bus. And you can have buses inside buses. It's crazy. Anyway, so that's how I mixed those vocals. The only other thing that's really going on here, which I can share, is I started using a lot more samples, dance samples, dubstep samples, things that kind of have an electronic flair but kind of support the song. So before we get to some of the choruses, I have these really long drags. And these all kind of just like slide up. And then there's some, kick drum stuff. I think this is just helpful for separate sections of the song. So, and I can give a big thanks to 16 in Mono for showing me a great pack that I've been using for finding some of these. As well as just, you can find all sorts of free samples all over the place. I love freesound.org. But remember, if you are selling a song, you need to own the rights. So if you look for samples, look for Creative Commons samples, or look for Attribute Commons, I think. Attribute license, which means you just need to credit the person who created the original sample. And that's what's going on for most of these. A lot of just like subtle whooshes. I don't want the listener to hear them. I want them to feel them, if that makes sense. So, just like this one, the big drum build, there's another one. Now, as much as I wish we were over, we do have one last section to cover. This is the master chain. Now, from what I've kind of developed from seeing others, from copying others, especially from a lot of these professionals who have made their videos, such as, again, Nolly Get Good, I've really enjoyed this sort of chain order. So I've been using this sort of copycatted EQ because I believe in its function. So when I start mixing, I want it to sound radio bright, and I want it to have some good low end. So I leave these on, and I've tweaked them just a little bit for my preference, which is still pretty darn bright. The next thing I do is tape saturation, and I like to just apply some subtlety to the high end here. I like the clean tape setting on the Saturn. There's a ton of free plugins that work well for tape saturation. And if you don't understand what tape saturation is, the idea is that, digital music is all done in, squares, and it can be very harsh to the ears. And tape saturation will add a little bit of warmth that I think connects those digital, sounds and samples at the lowest level. And it kind of just helps glue them a little bit better. So Again, it's subtle, but you can hear the difference. Now, the next thing I do, and this is something I've been doing a little bit, I want to do a little more, is I only take my multi-band compressor. Here is the iZotope Ozone 5 Dynamics plugin, which is basically their multi-band compressor. And I take the low end and I compress it a little bit. I've got kind of like a low ratio just because I know that my low end gets out of whack when I'm playing in 5-string and bass tunings and 7 strings. So if you solo it, now you'll notice you heard the choir going off. That's because, again, this is all happening to the instrumental because these are already compressed and they're already getting so much of the flavor that I don't see it quite necessary to apply most of these effects to the vocals as well. But yeah, it keeps some control, and you saw like a good amount of decibels being lost here, just like 3 to 5. And then I use the Slate Compressor, and I like this one because it's so simple and it glues everything perfectly. I'm sure any other compressor does this, but for some reason I just really enjoy this one. I set a high pass filter because we've already compressed the low end, and then the ratio is at 4, releases around 0.3 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds for the attack. So it's really about smoothness and subtlety. And I like to just take off, 3 dB. This one's getting it a little more, but I think the end result is much, much, much smoother. If you're wondering why your music doesn't sound smooth and you haven't been using a compressor on the mix bus, give it a shot. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is just an Imager app. This is a completely free one, and for whatever reason, I just like it. It's so simple. It's the Ozone Imager, and I just add a little bit of digital width. I think this kind of helps to spread things in between each other, which kind of sounds weird, but I think what it does is your image of your song just gets a little bit more beautiful that way. And from there, honestly, it's just a wider mix, and it sounds live, it sounds together. And what I would normally do is I'll have a limiter plugin, but the limiter plugin would destroy my computer right now, so unfortunately I won't really be able to show you how to use a limiter. The idea with the limiter is, of course, here's your soundbar. You want to get as close to the listener's 0 dB without actually crunching and clipping and smushing your song. So I set usually the output to be like minus a couple dB at most. And then I just raise the gain until I'm there. And the best thing for mixing is cross-reference the mix. Check if it's too loud somewhere else. Check if someone else's song is louder or quieter. Loudness has a lot of meanings too. If your low end is too high, then your song might be, loud for some reason, or it might not be loud enough. You might not be able to get it loud enough because, loudness is such a complex concept. But, that's for another rainy day. Anyway, this is how I mix Suicide Mission. It's not my best mix ever, I'm sure, because the next one will always be better. But I am proud of this. I think Lord Bif and I are both really happy with the sound and the video. So if you have not watched that, please go check it out. Subscribe to this channel for tutorials on Ropanu 2. Subscribe to Lord Bif if you want fantastic video game remixes. And of course, please subscribe to me, Ropaniganti. Hopefully we'll get to 10k subs, and I'm going to be making as much music and hopefully more tutorials just like this one. This has been Mixing with Ro. Have a good one.